women sociologists. Some of them you already know. So I included them, those who you already know. I think you already know, I don't know. In my case, for example, Dorothy Smith, in the second year, in the second semester, I talked about Dorothy Smith to the Turkish class. But I presume you did that too, because there is a chapter on Dorothy Smith in later's book. Chodorow, you already encountered with her in your first year, Giddens Sociology, Introduction to Sociology. There's a page about Chodorow. And I included Butler and Mitchel. Maybe you heard about these women sociologists in other courses, especially in sociology of gender. But in this theory class, I also wanted to talk about women sociologists, because if I don't, it would be excluding them. Now, I will start with exclusion of founding women sociologists. You know, in your first year, in the second year, first sociology course, maybe you heard of these names: Harriet Martineau, Jane Addams, and Marion Weber. But usually there are no independent chapters on them. They are just mentioned. Harriet Martineau is mentioned because she translated Auguste Comte's book into English. But she was an independent, not only a translator of Auguste Comte's book, but she was an independent sociologist. Jane Addams in America, Harriet Martineau was in England. Jane Addams in America, she was very active. You know, these are 19th century. These are Harriet Martineau, born in 1802 and lived until 1876. You see, more or less younger than Marx, for example. Marx is born in 1818, 15, 16 years younger than her. Okay, now Jane Addams was very active in America in women's rights. She established a research center, which also worked as a social work type of center, helping poor people. And Marianne Weber in Germany. Now, if Marianne Weber was not an active sociologist, it is likely that Max Weber wouldn't have been one of the three founders of sociology, because Max Weber died, as I mentioned before, during pandemic, influenza pandemic in 1918, 1920. He died and he left all material in his room. Now Marianne Weber collected them, edited them, and published them. And she published a biography of Max Weber. But as I said, usually internationally, globally, these sociologists, these women sociologists are forgotten. Now, I have put here women founders of sociology, a chapter in English. You can read that. Now, in this chapter that you can read, they say they are not forgotten, they are excluded. The patriarchal, male-dominant world, academic world, male-dominant, academic world excluded them, pushed them out of the field. In the field of now, from the point of view of Bourdieu, in the field of sociologists, sociologists are struggling with each other. What type of sociology is going to be dominant, is more scientific, is a better capture of society, a better understanding of society, and they are struggling. Now in this struggle, whereas during their times, these women founders were active in the shaping, they were active in the field, but they are excluded from the field in a later generation when they are not anymore active, and the founders are reduced to all men, unfortunately. That is the thesis of this chapter. Now, before I start today's contemporary women sociologists, I have to mention that in the course that I teach in the second semester of the fourth year, development of sociology in Turkey, I talk about founding women sociologists in Turkey, who are Behice Boran, Mübeccel Kray, Amiran Kurtkan Bilgiseven, Nermin Abadan Unat. So next semester, we will be talking about these women founders of sociology in Turkey. Okay, now today's lecture on contemporary women sociologists. Dorothy Smith, actually, she can even be considered as one of the, in the generation of founders. She's born in 1926, but indeed, her story of coming into sociology and experiencing that exclusion and struggling for the inclusion. She is really a good example of struggling in the field of sociology to include women's point of view, women's standpoint, and that is that's her concept actually that she contributed to sociology. No, says there is a male dominant standpoints, male approaches. Men are dominant in the society and in the social sciences. Now, especially in natural sciences, there are universalist discourses, and mostly by men. Okay, there are Maria Curie, and there are few women physicists or biologists. Now, increasingly so. For example, this year, there were more women. For example, 2 women physiologists had a Nobel Prize in physiology, reading, editing of genome. Anyway, at that time, though, in 1920s, 30s, 40s, it was natural sciences was male dominant. Very few women in social sciences also. And Dorothy Smith, as a sociologist, entered into this field, and she said that women living in the neighborhoods, actually quoting Habermas, in the life world, where language, people talk with each other. That's how they come to understanding. And then there's an external social structures and institutions, and relations of ruling. So instead of Marxist relations of production, she said, from the point of view of women, analyzing women in their life worlds, of course, relations of production, market forces, capitalist market forces are important, but relations of ruling in the institutions, in the state institutions, in the formal institutions of the macro social structure, which again here Habermas, which is colonizing the life world, is coming and influencing the life world. Now, Habermas pointed this out, life world being colonized by economic and political systems, but he didn't give any information, any understanding of women living there. Now, Dorothy Smith does that. Dorothy Smith is in the opposite pole where Habermas stands. Okay. Now, Habermas is aware that there is subjective aspect too. The point of view of the actor is important, but he is more in the theoretical and in the macro side. Although theoretically, he recognizes that there is a micro, there is a life world aspect, there is the subjective, emotional aspect, whereas in order to understand and analyze systems, we need more theoretical and objective analyses. But as I said, Dorothy Smith complements, in a sense, or brings a new vision, women's standpoint, women's way of looking into this social world, and how women experience text, written material. Yeah, usually they are written official material. And you might have observed in your neighborhoods or in the villages, you know, you can one can do that also in the neighborhoods of the cities. Some official document arrives to the address, and then woman opens that, and if the woman, and sometimes earlier years, they were not able to read and write, because women were excluded from the educational field, which is now opposite. Now we are, fortunately, there are more women in secondary education, primary education, even in the university education, there are more. But 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that was not the case. It was the opposite. So opens that the text, official text. Now it could be a reading of electricity, how much should be paid, how many kilowatts of electricity is being used in the household, etc. So either calls for someone, looks for someone who reads and writes, or fortunately she has children who are going to school, and they will read that for her, and she's puzzled, really. So Dorothy Smith talks about this puzzlement of women when they are exposed to these official texts, letters. So since women are mostly living in the family, in the life world, they don't have this instrumental, purposeful agency of man, and they have a more comprehensive, a micro life world appreciation of the social structure from the other end. But now, after studying all these, Dorothy Smith developed an approach, a paradoxical terminology. She used institutional ethnography. If you remember, ethnography from anthropology, ethnography is participant observation of living worlds, of villages, of neighborhoods. But now, Dorothy Smith, as a sociologist, is studying institutions, but studying institutions ethnographically, with participant observation, like women study their own life worlds. Institutions where men are dominant can be studied ethnographically from women's point of view, and perhaps they can be transformed to include more women. As a matter of fact, more and more women are working in those institutions. But then there is a bifurcation of women's consciousness. Working in these institutions, also instrumental rational, purposeful rational, and living in their life worlds, which is more emotional and geared to understanding and communicative. It's a more communicative reason and instrumentalism. So they are divided into two. But Dorothy Smith was able to combine these and develop early, like in 50s and 60s. Her book, for example, some of her books are written quite early. For example, in 1977, there is a book. 1987, there is one in 1975. Anyway, 70s. Okay, not early as I thought. Not early as 50s, but 60s and 70s. Okay, so she also studied educational sociology and how money helps in understanding school as an institution. So indeed, you have already been exposed to her perhaps in your second year. So this is my summary of Dorothy Smith's contributions to sociology as a contemporary woman sociologist. Okay, the second sociologist, social psychologist, sociologist, or psychologist, sociologist, perhaps, combining the two, is Nancy Chodorow. Now, Nancy Chodorow is born in 1940s, so in comparison to Dorothy Smith, she is younger. But her article in 1978, Reproduction of Mothering, so she, like Dorothy Smith, she focused on the woman and on mothering. She made a verb from a noun, mothering. Now, for sociology, production and reproduction, these are two important concepts: production and reproduction. Now, actually, these two words are also important biologically too. But biological reproduction and biological production, of course, that is procurement, how new babies are born in the various species. Now, in sociology, social reproduction and social, economic, sociocultural production, of course. Now, reproduction of society, social reproduction part of society takes place in the life world, in the family, by the mothers, mostly by the mothers, not mostly, 90%. Maybe there are some caregivers in cases where mothers died or whatever, but outside of that, children are born and raised by mothers. They are taught the language, the culture of the society. More important than that, they are taught to be man or boy and girl, how to be a girl and a boy. Now, here she used psychoanalysis, and actually she critically used Freud's contributions to development of male and female selves, identities, genders. So now, although this is not in Freud, in Nancy Chodorow, there is already this differentiation of male and female selves, how they are differentiated. Now, her qualification is relational female self, relational woman self. Women's selves are relational, whereas man's selves are less relational, more separate, more autonomous, more independent from the now how that now we observe that how that takes place. That's what Chodorow tries to understand, and here going from borrowing from the phases from Freud, she says that although in the Freud it is audible phase that is most important, she says already in pre-audible dyadic relationship, mother and child, mother and baby, there already some kind of differentiation in that mother-girl relationship and mother-boy relationship in the pre-Oedipal phase is already experienced, and where daughters experience powerful bonding, being from same sex, similarity, whereas boys being different from the mother. So that difference is already being experienced, and it is mutual. Mother and girl, daughter, and mother and son, they experience this, and hence the symbiotic relationship, mutual dependency of the baby, of the child, and the mother is longer in the case of daughters and shorter in the case of sons. And now in the Oedipal phase, that becomes more pronounced, whereas girls' attachment is more diffuse, boys' attachment is more dyadic to 2 by 2, whereas girls experience more than 2, includes father as well, or siblings as well, more so than the boys. And that is the second phase. In the third phase, now, according to Chodorow, third phase for boys is there is a severe act of repression of his attachment to his mother. So there is a forceful and rigid detachment. Whereas in the case of girls, it is milder and less severe, and hence there's a continuity in the connection, whereas there's a break in the case of boys. That is this is being discussed, criticized, etc. But that's her thesis. Now, through this explanation, in this third phase, her diagnosis that women are more relational, and men more separate, more autonomous, is already built into the socialization, the third phase of socialization. Now, so this was this 1978 reproduction of mothering. She put forth her new approach, critical of psychoanalysis and Freud, but combining psychoanalysis and sociology. In 1989, she wrote a book, Feminism and Psychoanalytic Theory, where she moved further away from individualistic approach of psychoanalysis and moved more towards sociology. Relational and intersubjectivity, phenomenological sociologies, intersubjective analyses, and to understand relationality and independence. In this book, she elaborated that approach. And then 5 years later, in 1994, she wrote Feminities, Masculinities, and Sexualities, Freud and Beyond. So she is critical of Freud's generalization of his observations in Austria, as if it is true for all societies. No, says Nancy Chodorow, because cultures now in formation of selves, relationships, building of social groups, societies, cultures are important. And since there are cultural differentiations in the world, there is also cultural and also social psychological differentiation in terms of raising of children, raising of boys and girls, men and women. Now in the next book, in The Power of Feelings, Personal Meaning in Psychoanalysis, Gender and Culture, that is the subtitle of the book. Self is analyzed as a gendered self, which is already from the beginning, it is in her theory. Now, self is analyzed as both psychic, psychological, and cultural, rather than psychological or cultural. Now, instead of, she says that instead of using either or, dichotomizing, dualistic, instead of dualistic approach, she's advocating theories of both and both psychic and cultural, both internal and external factors, while explaining the development of bonding relationships, attachments, development of selves, identities. So she created an approach, a sociological approach, which goes from, or which combines both micro and macro aspects of social life, both psychic and cultural aspects of social life, both aspects in social life, both female, women's aspects, relational approaches, and man's more linear, relatively autonomous approaches, both, considering both of them. Okay, I think this is maybe a short summary of Nancy Chodorow's sociological approach. I think now I come to Judith Butler. Now, Judith is younger than Nancy Chodorow. She's born in 1956. I put here a chapter which is being shared, actually, a PDF, an account of oneself. How a psychologist, a sociologist, is able to understand oneself, give an account of oneself. If you remember, Bourdieu wrote a short sketch of his life, a sketch for a biography, and he said this is not an autobiography, because autobiographical approach to one's life is usually an illusion. There are many illusions, because again, you have seen this in Foucault too, because autobiographical accounting of one's life assumes continuity, consistency, whereas societies and human lives, individuals, selves, are not continuous. There are interruptions, there are discontinuities, etc., etc. Now, Judith Butler recognizes this shortcoming. So she's not saying it is an autobiography. She's not writing an autobiography, but she's taking up this issue of giving an account of oneself. Now, how one can sociologically, social psychologically give an explanation of why I am, and why a person is that person, and not somebody else, through what kind of developments or interruptions he became that person. Anyway, and it's as I said, a chapter of a longer book. Maybe you might try to read it. Anyway, that is one of later books. Now, the book that made her famous is gender trouble, subversion of identities, feminism as subversion of identity, where actually she criticizes feministic approach that divides man, woman as two categories, as if woman is an homogeneous one category. So instead of just looking at woman's identity on the basis of this dualistic division of and usually biologically based division of man and woman, she developed in this book an approach where gender, independent, although related to biological sex, is socioculturally constructed through performative acts and significations. So there she started how gender construction, gender differentiation should be studied sociologically, social psychologically, and she created a Butler's way of analyzing gender. Now, in her second book, Bodies That Matter, which is the translation into Turkish is really interesting. Belalı bedenler. She continues these analyses. But today I will not go into the analysis or the summarizing these books, but I will try to make an introduction to her book, which is titled The Psychic Life of Power. The Psychic Life of Power, Theories in Subjection. Theories in Subjection. Now, subjection, we already have seen this in Foucault, especially, the subject, how subject is being constructed in relationship to power and discourses. Now, there we have seen that subjection, being a subject of a king, there being, you see, in Turkish, we have subjection, one meaning, and being a subject to a king or a sovereign, in Turkish is tabiyet, teba, being subjected to a king. Being a subject, in English, we use the same word, is özne in Turkish. So özne, özneleşme, and tabiyet. We have two words, actually, one Ottoman, one Turkish. But in English and in French, there is one word, subject, which means both of them. But both Foucault and Butler thinks that actually it is good that the same word is being used, because for the establishment of individual subject, the first type of subordination, subordination to the power, being subject to power, is crucial, is actually being construction of subject is related to being subject to a power. Actually, she develops her argument using, I already mentioned Foucault, but she uses Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, and Althusser in addition to Foucault. Although it is mainly Foucault, but in this book, she also introduces other theories. For example, this Hegel thing, where she talks about Hegel's famous slave and master dialectic. Now, when a slave is freed, he is not anymore subordinated to the master. But Hegel says, but slave, now the independent, free slave, experiences an unhappy consciousness because the slave, he finds out that master is in himself. Master, it is not anymore subordinated to the master, but now in his or her subjectness, there is already a master to the internal master. She is now subjected, or being a free subject is dependent on, now it seems, or is together with, it is not independent of, it is not freed really, it is not independent, but dependent on that earlier subordination, or even now in Butler's terminology, earlier attachment, because when we think of, in general, not master-slave, but parents and children. Now, when we think of parents and children, a baby, a child, becomes a subject. The condition of becoming a self, in Nancy Chodorow or some others, now that becoming a self, a subject, is dependent on subjection to being dependent, utterly 100% dependent on the mother and the father. And it is dependent, now this dependence is not just physical dependence, it is emotional dependence. It's an attachment. It is an attachment. So baby is subordinated to the parents, of course, as an helpless being. He cannot live by himself, herself, and she's emotionally attached. So this emotional attachment and hence this parental authority, parental power, the power relationship between parents and children, again, remember Foucault, is an essential part of construction of subject, being a subject, being a subject. So here, actually, really, Butler is using Foucault's approach, but she also uses, and now remember Althusser from your second semester. Now, in Althusser, there is this interpellation. In his book, Ideological State Apparatuses, in that book, Althusser talks about how a subject emerges through interpellation. Interpellation here is a calling by the authority. Now, usually, the example, the famous example, is a person walking on the street, and then the police calls, "Hey, you!" And then the person, almost 99%, I don't know what is the percentage, but turns to the police, thinks that it is him or her being called, whereas it is, "Hey, you." But now, from this example, Althusser says that ideology, and in the ideology, authority interpellates the big authority. Now, that could be state authority combined with religious authority, state authority combined with parental authority or teacher. An authority interpellates people in the society. And as you remember, anyway, personalities in the society are not autonomous, from the point of view. He's a structuralist, as you remember. So through this interpellation and formation of a subject, being a subject, is being able to carry out the institutions, the economic relationships, power relationships, all other cultural relationships. Anyway, always the bearing of them, supporting of them, is secured by this kind of a dependent subject. Whereas in Butler and Foucault, there is the possibility that although the subject is being built in subjection or through subordination, subordination is the condition of development of the subject, emergence of the subject. There is kind of a relative autonomy of from that subjection. Now, if you remember, Foucault talks about self-knowledge, self-care, and in addition to being subjected to the powers in the society, one can be subjected to his her self, her ethical self, which is relatively autonomous, but still it is subjectness. It is subjectness in both senses. Of the subject. Now, Butler develops this in such a way that, especially with Nietzsche, she includes conscience. Now, in the same way that in Hegel, the freed slave, finds the master in himself, herself. Now, in Nietzsche, this is conscience. Conscience. One has now, and Butler uses this. Now, usually people, and if people feel guilty, now, if there is this guilt feeling, and conscience, in Turkish vicdan, conscience go together. A person with conscience is a person who feels guilty, some kind of guilt, which originates in the familial context, in the attachment. She calls that passionate attachment. Passionate attachments in the early subordination, in the early subjection, later is transformed into a kind of guilt and a kind of and in relationship with this guilt, conscience. Now, people having no guilt feeling or weak guilt feeling will have weak conscience in their relationships with themselves and with others. And this is one of the implications of Judith Butler's analysis. So what she is doing is what is being expressed in the title of the book, The Psychic Life of Power. Psychic. Now, how that passionate attachments, subordination, subjection is the condition of emergence of subject, as the subject somehow turns on itself, on herself, himself, a turning, looking back to himself, herself, and her, his relationships in the conditions of subjection or subordination, and having in this turning or returning, or this is a kind of circular reflexivity, kind of a reflexive turning. Now, the reflexivity is very important in sociology, in Bourdieu or Giddens, you know, at the macro sociological level as well. But here in the micro sociological level, how crucial is this reflexive turning on his, her subordination or subjection, and in the process, and by this turning, now here one can say subjects reflexively turns. No, but there is no subject yet. By this reflexive turning, something non-existent starts existing, and as there are more and more performative reflexive turnings, and that way significations, subject is being constructed, emerges. This kind of a reasoning, it is a complex reading, but a good reading into the workings of power relationships. Now, in Foucault, that was more in the medium level. Of course, Foucault took power from hierarchical state level and brought it to the into the networks of people, into relationships of the people. Now, Butler takes it into the psychic level, and the workings of power in psychic life. The psychic life of power is, in this sense, a good reading. Okay, now I will go to our fourth woman sociologist today, Judith Mitchel. Now, Judith Mitchel, in 1966, wrote this book, Women, The Longest Revolution. The Longest Revolution. Now, she is also like Chodorow, from combining psychoanalysis and sociology. And in psychoanalysis, she joined at that time in 1960s anti-psychiatry movement. Again, from second year, from your second year in later, there's a section on Ronald Lang when he's talking about phenomenological sociologists, like Schutz and Peter Berger and ethnomethodology. There's also Ronald Lang, who is actually a psychiatrist who is against psychiatry. Now, who turned into sociology in a sense to understand psychological pathologies like depression or anyways, psychoses, even psychoses, not only neuroses but also psychoses. Now, Juliet Mitchell also was like him, used psychoanalysis critically and focused on the patriarchal family, how to analyze and go beyond patriarchal family in society. So she is one of those women who contributed to women's movement during 60s and 70s. Actually, this movement, as you might remember from your other courses, started with Simone de Beauvoir's second sex, how women like Dorothy Smith was saying, how women are excluded from social life, economic life, political life, and they are in the life world or in the family, almost secluded there, seclusion of women in the patriarchal family. Now, Simone de Beauvoir brought this into open, but she's a novelist. She is in literature. So Juliet Mitchell brought it into social sciences. She also, like Judith Butler, used Althusser's relative autonomy, over-determination, those kind of conceptualizations. And this is in 1960s. Now, Althusserian approach was a structuralist Marxist approach, which was going beyond the economistic Marxism, and it was becoming an analytical framework to analyze women in their life worlds, in their family situations. Actually, she criticizes economistic Marxism not being able or excluding or accepting the patriarchal family situation for women without much analysis, uncritical acceptance, she says. But with Althusser's conceptualization, she was able to go beyond that and study women in production as well as in reproduction. That is, in social reproduction, of course, in biological reproduction as well, and in socialization. And these are different factors, that different dimensions influencing women. So already in this first book, The Woman, the Longest Evolution, she brought these into open. Now, in 1972, she wrote Woman's Estate. Now, here, the thesis that already developed in the first one is further analyzed, and those which accept women's situation as it is further criticized, critically assessed, and women's monotonous life in patriarchal family and how it can be enlarged, how it can be freed and brought into the public sphere from the private sphere. Now that is being discussed and analyzed in this in her second book. In third book, she establishes a relationship like Nancy Chodorow did, like in a sense Judith Butler did, between psychoanalysis and feminism. And whereas Chodorow is more critical of Freud, and hence many feminists see Freud as the enemy for women's movement. Now, Mitchel says, no, Freud is not enemy. We can transform Freud's approach to better understand women's situation, women's estate in the society. So, like Chodorow, she also goes into this mother-child relationship, and instead of Lacan's, or in opposition to Lacan's law of the father, now Lacan, as you might heard again in your other courses, is a further development of Freud's psychoanalytical approach in the 60s and 70s. In opposition to Lacan's law of father, the symbolic order intervening into the real, Mitchel establishes law of the mother. Now, in this sense, similar to Nancy Chodorow. So in this book, she expressed the hope that in future liberated non-patriarchal society, women will not be thought of as exchanging, as in the unconscious of the society, collective unconscious. In earlier anthropological studies, women are exchanged between tribes to connect tribes to each other by exchanging women. So that exchanging of women ceases and women become independent human beings. Her last book, no, not last book, next book, which is published in 2003, is on siblings. In a family, usually in all these analyses, approaches, and a hierarchical, two-generational approach is being used, parents and children. Whereas, she says, in the family, there is also a horizontal relationship. sisters and brothers. Sisters and brothers, siblings, are related to each other. And in the development of personality, in the development of self, in the development of subjectness, of being a self, she says the first trauma actually is being born. This overstimulation of children, babies cry, overstimulation. The first trauma is being born. She says the second trauma is actually coming of a sibling. Now, suddenly, this mother-child relationship, which is and in early years is very symbiotic. Mother is just for me kind of approach. Suddenly, she realizes that mother gave birth to another person like himself, herself. Now, she says, now this exposure to the sibling, to the birth of the sibling, actually leads to the emergence of thinking. Now, in the classical Freudian analysis, thinking, the philosopher in people emerges while trying to understand where does babies come from, the question of where does baby come. But she says, Mitchel says, more important than that, now a child who's exposed to the birth of a new brother, sister, is asking the question, who am I now? Now that mother has another me or another person similar to me, whom am I? And here she says the difference, identity and difference emerges. The conception, the uniqueness is being lost, and out of that loss, actually, out of that loss is built a self which starts perceiving, thinking himself, herself, mother, new sibling, father, in the formation of self. For example, in Judith Butler, subordination is very important. But here, siblings, it's not subordination. It is actually a competition, a rivalry, and actually, the subtitle of the siblings book is Sexuality and Violence. Now, violence, the violent aspect of the personality, she says, Mitchel says, is also a first experience. The anger, even the hate against this new intrusion of this new baby. Now, this is really an interesting book. So Mitchel, Juliette Mitchel, had contributed. Now, this part I borrowed from Janet Thorman, who reviewed this book and brought out these aspects. So I have to recognize her contribution. Okay, now I will stop here, friends, and as I usually do, ask your feedback, your response. How was this going through women sociologists? I could actually, divide it to 2 by 2. There are, as you know, in the book Profiles in Contemporary Social Theory, there are other women sociologists. But in previous years, I was talking more about women sociologists. But students said, teacher, we take a course in gender, so we have too much gender study, and these women usually emphasize gender, so 2 is enough. Although I went through 4 of them instead of dividing, instead of 6 or 7 or 8. So I still insisted that it is better. 2 of them you already had, so I added 2 new ones actually. Okay, I have to stop here and have some tea or coffee while waiting for your feedback, for your response. What do you think? And here, of course, except Özkan, all of you are women. So I'm hoping that in the 3rd generation sociologists, the opposite will happen of the founders. In the founders, there were women and men, but women were excluded. But now in this new generation, when you become sociologists all over in the world, I hope that there will be more women sociologists, and I hope they will not exclude men, male sociologists, although their number will be less, I will imagine. They will be a minority. Men will be in minority, most likely. You will say, Bahattin Hocam, he said that we will be more dominant, or at least in majority. Now this is 20 years from now. You will be thinking this.